So yeah, it's always like, I reflect when I come to these things how much it feels like being at home. Like why does it feel so like a home at a place like this, and so not at home in other places where we live? Maybe I live in New York City, and I'm 58 years old. So I was born in 1966, which was the heart of the 60s. It was the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, which defined kind of the 60s astrologically. And when I give talks, I usually like to start with my personal background, how I got interested in different subjects. I almost have to remember who I am and how I got to be thinking about all these topics and so on. So I was born in New York City. My parents were artists. My dad was an abstract painter. He was actually from Brighton or Hove, and he became obsessed with abstract art in the 50s. And he tried to join the abstract expressionists, but he got there too late. So then he painted very large abstract paintings. My mother was a writer. She's still alive. Actually, my father passed away. And when my mother was very young, she was involved with the Beat generation, with Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and so on. People know Jack Kerouac still on the road and so on. Okay, cool. But it's funny. Some people don't really know that stuff anymore. It's very interesting. So she was with Kerouac. She was in a relationship with him in 1957 when On the Road came out, which was his generation-defining book, which kind of opened up the whole 60s movement, the beats leading to the hippies and so on. And so that was kind of like my cultural context in a way. And but I grew up in a background in New York City in the 70s and 80s. That was there wasn't any spirituality or esotericism or even traditional religion. Everybody had completely shifted to scientific materialism, secular materialism. So I grew up with the assumption that was shared by basically everybody that I knew, my teachers, my family, my friends, that this life was it, that consciousness was completely an epiphenomenon of the brain. And so when we died, that was just extinguished. There would be no possibility of a continuation of a soul or a spirit, or and in a way it felt very nihilistic. I dropped out of college. I was working in magazines, and I started a literary magazine with friends. And my friends were into heroin and alcohol, heavy drinking, and cocaine. And there was beauties, there was creativity, but underlying it, I began to realize there was this incredible grief around sort of life being ultimately kind of empty and meaningless, and that I also had that heaviness, that grief. And so I guess my mid to late 20s, I fell into kind of existential panic or despair. And I began to ask myself, had there been any other possibilities in my life? Had I come into contact with anything that suggested there might be something else? So then I remembered my psychedelic experiences. I'd had a handful of experiences at Wesleyan in Connecticut with mushrooms and LSD. And they had definitely suggested, that maybe there's something else happening in the psyche. Maybe there are other dimensions of consciousness that are worth exploring. So that ultimately led me to write my first book, Breaking Open the Head. And for that book, I just ended up going to the Gabon to go through the Bwiti initiation. Bruce, in the last discussion, talked about his Bwiti experience. And it's a very profound, I'm sure everybody here knows about iboga at this point, I imagine most. So it's an African psychedelic. You find it in Gabon and Cameroon. It's the longest lasting psychedelic. It is about a 20 to 25 hour journey. And it has a number of stages and phases, and going down, it was kind of a somewhat difficult situation because I was with a botanist who didn't have the most perfect relationship with the shaman or the Nganga, and he started demanding more money from us before the ceremony, and so on. So so we went into this slightly we felt kind of like an insecure situation, but the substance itself was extremely profound. And there was a stage of kind of your eyes are open, and they sit you in front of a mirror, and you see visions with your eyes open. And at one point I saw this large kind of wooden figure walk across the room and sit next to the shaman, which was completely an eyes open vision. And after the ceremony, I was like, well, what was this figure? And they were like, oh yeah, that's the spirit of iboga, who comes out, and he sort of opens the gateway, So it was extraordinary. I would see these things, they would just have very clear explanations and understandings of what they were. And during the iboga experiences with the Bwiti, I encountered a few kind of experiences that I couldn't explain in terms of a materialist worldview that would just see consciousness as separate and embedded in the individual brain. So, for instance, one of the Nagangas said that he could see the spirit of my mother's mother hovering over my body, and that she had died recently, and she, was still very possessive and was kind of keeping me from going into some aspects of the spirit world. And I was kind of shocked by that, because it was true that my mother's mother had died within a year, my grandmother, but I hadn't told anybody that. And it just seemed that he had access to some transpersonal knowledge. And the more that I explored shamanism, writing my first book, the more those types of experiences happened, where you would encounter, shamans would bring back pieces of knowledge that they didn't seem to have any awareness of. And then all sorts of other, I ended up going to Ecuador to visit the Sequoia, an indigenous culture that works with ayahuasca, and visiting the Mazateks, which is where we rediscovered psilocybin in the 50s, excuse me. And I also explored kind of other, kind of modern psychedelics, obviously LSD, but also synthetic ones, 2CB. I interviewed Alexander Shulgin, who was kind of like the father of modern psychedelic chemistry, and visited his lab and so on. And so that book ended up, as I went through the process of researching and discovering, I had to make a shift. I had so many psychic experiences, shamanic experiences, that I ultimately shifted from a materialist worldview to a kind of shamanic worldview, or from a Freudian worldview to a Jungian worldview. And I guess part of that book also, when I visited the Amazon for the first time, I was with people who'd gone there many times, and we went through a lot of parts of the Amazon that had been deforested, and where there was like mining concessions and so on, and they were telling me that, I think we all know this is happening, right? Like how much of the Amazon was going so quickly, and that every time they found a new oil prospect, they would drill, they would build roads, and that whole part of the Amazon would disappear, and then it would be like hundreds of thousands of acres or whatever, and that would be enough oil to sustain just the U.S. demand for oil for like 2 or 3 days. So as I went through this process, I began to realize that we were in this kind of like suicide system on a macro level. So writing Breaking Up in the Head, we tend to kind of trust authorities. Like when we're young, we think that teachers know something, the institutions know something. But when I realized that, because at that time, like psychedelics were ridiculed and mocked. You couldn't even talk about them in the East Coast. People just laugh at you, and you couldn't talk about psychic phenomena or the paranormal. You still really can't in mainstream culture. But I realized that I now had these things demonstrated to me as being very valuable and very real and tangible, that I really couldn't trust anything that my culture, the mainstream culture, had to say about matters of importance. And a lot of what was most important was taboo or suppressed or whatever. So that led me then, as I kind of progressed as a writer and a thinker, to just have a very open field perspective. And also to kind of discover that sometimes where there's fear, taboo, repression, ridicule, mockery, there's actually some kind of like energy there. It's like a cultural acupuncture point, and there's something that actually needs to be gone into deeper. So that was also part of my process. So as I wrote Breaking Up in the Head, I also discovered works of people like Terence McKenna. How many people have had like a Terence McKenna kind of deep dive? He's an incredible thinker, just beautiful mind, visionary. And Jose Arguelles, people know Jose Arguelles at all? So he was also a psychedelic philosopher of kind of the 70s and 80s. And both of them, although I don't think they were really even friends or connected, sort of beamed independently into these ideas around the Mayan prophecies and the Mayan calendar. Jose ended up going really deep, and he created his own version of the Mayan calendar called the Dream Spell, and looked at the mathematics of the Mayan calendar. Some of his books are still very beautiful. One is called Earth Ascending. Terence, of course, in the 70s with his brother, they went down to the Amazon and they took a huge amount of mushrooms, and Terence felt that he was in telepathic communication with this mushroom intelligence for a week, and it was downloading information and had all these sort of psychic effects. And the mushroom kind of told him that we didn't really understand time properly, and that time was actually, history was actually speeding up, and time was sort of about the ingression of novelty. So you could have, even though you could have more things happening in a smaller period of time, and that could go exponential and so on. So Jose began to think that, Terence began to think that in some way we're moving towards, quote unquote, the end of time, or some kind of like shift that he talked about as the eschaton or the singularity. And he developed a software program kind of based on the I Ching. He was downloaded all this information, and he kind of discovered that, around 2012 was the end of this cycle. And so back in 2003, 2004, I got really fascinated with trying to understand, these ideas around prophecy and time and the Mayans and the Mesoamerican conceptions of reality. This led me to write my second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, which once again covered a lot of different topics, including, since we're in England, I can't help but mention the crop circles. And I'm going to leave open a bunch of tabs, so if people, when I'm finished with my rambling rant, you can pick up a question and like if there's something that particularly appeals to you or something that you want to like me to go deeper into. So I was looking kind of for corollaries in the material and physical world to the types of geometrical experiences and patternings and so on you discover in deep psychedelic states. And I learned about the crop circles, and I got an assignment from a Wired magazine to research into them. And so I was able to talk to kind of, some of the people who claim to be hoaxers, who claim to make them all, but also biophysicists who studied what happens to the crops and the formations, how they seem to be changed by some kind of a microwave energy from above. Landscape architects who've been trying to understand the meaning of the crop circles and basically argued that some of them, in terms of how perfectly they were laid out and how they were just done in one night, like near Stonehenge, so anybody would have seen it, or even in a few hours, that it really wasn't possible for humans to do that. So actually I spent, for the 2012 book, Michael Glickman, an Englishman who wrote a lot about the crop circles and passed away a few years ago, he also connected them to 2012 and this idea of a dimensional shift, whatever that means. So that was another clue for me that I followed in writing to 2012. And we can go back more into that and so on. So essentially, some of what I've been trying to do is kind of figure out, so if we're out of this secular materialist worldview, I mean, how many people here have had like psychic, paranormal, synchronistic experiences that have revealed to you that, the materialist worldview cannot be the whole story, Yeah. How many people here have not had that and still are staunchly scientific materialist? Yeah, so it's like we're getting past that in these types of communities and cultures. We're recognizing that materialist worldview is kind of obsolete, and I think that's very exciting. But then we have to kind of like I guess part of my work in a way is like arguing for the rational, intellectual, and mental aspect of this evolutionary spiritual process. And of course, it's important that it's very heart-based and feeling-based, and I feel all of that. And part of my journey right now is to get more into embodiment and heart and so on. But I also do think that the mind plays a crucial role. And the heart itself is a thinking organ. Apparently, it has like 70,000 neurons in it. So I don't think there's such a dichotomy. Like the heart and the mind are deeply connected. And I think we can use reason and the intellect as a kind of spiritual path. But that is difficult. It requires training, discernment, and I think we have to be very, very careful to make distinctions between things that we know from our own experience, things that seem well defined by a huge amount of evidence, and things that are more kind of like speculative or just thought experiments or something. So for instance, one of the speakers yesterday was talking about 12-strand DNA and so on. Some of that stuff, I mean, there's no, as far as I know, any evidence for that in the physical scientific world. So I think it's okay maybe to talk about stuff, but I think it's very important to make that delineation or that distinction when you're moving from anything that has like an evidence-based element and anything that maybe is more speculative or creative in a way. But I'm a big fan of creative, speculative thought, which I hope to get into a little bit as we go along. So yeah, so if it's not, reductive materialism or physicalism, if the basis of our universe is not physical, it's something else, then what is it? The two main alternatives are panpsychism or idealism. And sometimes idealism is called monistic idealism or analytic idealism. And so basically panpsychism would argue that everything in the universe has some kind of mental attribute or mind-like attribute, because otherwise how could consciousness exist in any way? But it's still kind of a dualistic, I can never really get my handle on panpsychism, to be honest. But for me, I'm much more of an analytic or monistic idealist. So that would be the idea that consciousness is actually the fundamental reality. It's the basis of our experience. Everything that we experience or talk about or know, we experience through consciousness, right? So this is also very much how Eastern metaphysics talks about the nature of reality, or let's say the ontology, let's say. So you can see Tibetan Buddhism talks about, kind of primordial awareness or the nature of mind being the intrinsic, underlying reality, and everything is kind of a projection or emanation from that field of pure consciousness. Now, I think as we begin to explore that as a concept, and I very much recommend one of my favorite philosophers and thinkers right now is Bernardo Kastrup, Kastrup, with a K. And he's written a number of books. One of his books is called Why Materialism is Baloney. Another one of his books is called More Than Allegory. So he was a scientist at CERN, so he very slowly and carefully kind of goes through this process of why materialism is a faulty ontology or way of understanding the nature of reality, and it's much, much more likely that we're in a consciousness-first reality, that consciousness is the foundation or the primary reality. And so he talks about us as individual beings in this field of consciousness. He calls us dissociated alters. Like of that primordial ground, it can only know itself by creating separate beings that can have self-reflective experiences. So in a way, the universe is concocted in such a way that beings like ourselves can arise and have an experience of the universe, right? Because if we weren't able to do that, there would be no self-reflection. The universe would not be able to create, explore itself, know itself in a self-reflective way. So Kastrup also talks about how, from this perspective, in a way, so in that sense, reality, as also Tibetan Buddhism talks about, is kind of like a dream, we're having these individual dreams within the collective dream. And just a way, when we sleep at night, we have these dream experiences where there's characters and scenes, and it can seem like totally real, but then we wake up in the morning and we realize that our mind just created this universe, this whole situation. That's kind of like the nature of reality itself. So this actually allows us to look at the universe and our lives and so on in a very different way. It allows us in a way to look at everything as allegory. As in a dream. If we're having individual dreams within the collective dream, we then can look at everything that happens or manifests in the field of awareness, let's say, as like a symbol that emerges in a dream, and that teaches us something about ourselves or about ourselves, about consciousness and so on. So and that accords very, very well with indigenous ontologies and indigenous beliefs, with animism, if you visit an indigenous culture, let's say the Kogi in Colombia, I was very privileged to go and visit them a few times and learn from them a little bit. And so for them, let's say a hummingbird comes into your hut and it has a butterfly in its mouth. They'll be like, oh, that means your cousin back home has just got an illness or something. But it's they know all of these things. They usually turn out to be correct. They have a way of understanding the sort of field of local awareness in this allegorical and symbolic structure, which completely makes sense in their worldview. So I guess part of what I'm seeking to do in my work is to help us kind of heal the ontology, heal the belief system. Because how many people here have visited indigenous cultures like the Amazon or Africa or anywhere? Yeah, how many people have found that things happen in those contexts that are impossible, let's say, in our context? They just simply don't happen. So what's going on, right? So, I think really people know Rupert Sheldrake's work. the morphogenetic field, morphic resonance, or whatever. So let's say that ultimately underlying, Sheldrake's idea is that there isn't like fixed laws in the universe. The universe, the universe is more like patterns or principles that become more coherent over time, let's say. So like, let's say a crystal forms, like there's a group of molecules together and a crystal suddenly forms. Well, that creates like a new morphogenetic field that allows, so when molecules come into that type of alignment, a crystal is more likely to form. And when that happens a lot of times, then it becomes like, it almost feels like a law because it just keeps happening. But actually it's still just a pattern or a principle that's become more coherent over time. So, but Sheldrake thinks that, everything is like that. So he's done studies on kind of, let's say even like solving puzzles, like crossword puzzles that are very difficult. Like at first nobody can solve them, but then maybe like one or two people solve them, and then they've begun to sort of create like this new morphogenetic field, and that's a collective resonance that allows for more and more people to be able to solve that. Or the 100th monkey principle is another idea, right? Like if a few beings of a species like learn a new skill, how to use a new tool, the idea is that maybe not only other monkeys on that island, but those same monkeys all around the world have more access to that capacity. And so if you look at these indigenous cultures, let's say they've been living in a local environment for hundreds or thousands of years, they have their own language, their own linguistic structure, they have their mythologies that have arisen out of that place, they have their practices, they have their rituals, they're weaving the sort of different morphogenetic fields, and that allows for things to happen that in our world are kind of impossible. I think that if we go down this line of thinking, we begin to find like we can have a strong sense of coherence around how these things may be and what that could allow for the future. One book that I really appreciate is a book called The Psychedelic Future of the Mind, which is by an academic called Tom Roberts. And he looks at this idea, which has become very popular in the technology world in Silicon Valley, of the singularity. This idea that we're moving towards a technological singularity where humans are inevitably going to like merge with machines or become like AI beings or something. And he says, well, maybe that's not the right direction, that instead of technological singularity, it's more of a neurosingularity, where we begin to realize that we can use all of the knowledge from indigenous cultures, esoteric practices, all of the learnings that we've made about the brain and brain waves and so on, to really start to explore the vast range of mind-body states, and that these different mind-body states actually sometimes have different knowledge available to them, or different capacities or different powers, up to qigong masters who can throw people across the room with their qi, or Tibetan monks who achieve like a rainbow body, and their physical body sort of shrinks and then dissolves after death, which it seems fairly well documented that this occurs. So we could potentially think about the power of local cultures, the power of like a multiplicity of possibilities for how humanity could evolve in the framework of a universe based on consciousness, rather than just a materialist framework. So that interests me very much. So what else would be fun to talk about? So I guess, so one thing I've been trying to figure out is like, we're Western, most of us, come from this Western European background, let's say, and we were very much cut off from kind of esotericism, hermeticism, which some of us here are trying to like regather or regain, and it's a process, right? It's not that easy. For me, one of my great heroes has been Rudolf Steiner. How many people here have explored Rudolf Steiner's work a bit? So I thought I would talk a little bit about Steiner in this context, because Steiner was also a monistic idealist. So he was born in like 1865, I guess, in I think Austria. And as a young child, he apparently just had the ability to see into these other worlds and to talk to the spirits of the dead. And he just realized that nobody else around him had these abilities. Apparently, he found one old gardener who was like not even literate, but had this second sight. And Steiner began to realize that this was something that humans of the past had had. I mean, Bruce was talking about these indigenous people who live in the now, who don't even have a future or past tense, and can go into the forest and communicate directly with spirit beings and so on. So this was like an atavistic, let's say, like a talent, a capacity that humans maybe had, which they lost through for whatever reason over the last thousands of years. But for whatever reason, Steiner himself had this. What's that? Okay, cool. Steiner had this ability. So I think that so when Steiner then didn't talk about his own esoteric investigations until he was 40 years old and had a doctorate of philosophy and was studying Goethe's science papers. Then he began to be part of the Theosophy movement. He was the head of the Theosophy Society in Germany. And then over the next 20, 25 years, he laid out this very elaborate kind of esoteric worldview. He ultimately said that the mission of his life on Earth was to bring the knowledge of reincarnation back to the West, which we'd lost it after the pagan mystery schools had been supplanted by Christianity. And he said that not only did human beings incarnate again and again, but the Earth itself reincarnated. And for Steiner, we were currently in the fourth incarnation of the Earth. And I found this very fascinating because this is also what a lot of the Mesoamerican prophecies, like the Hopi, talk about this being the fourth world. We're moving towards the fifth world. The Mayans, the Aztecs talk about the age of the fifth sun, moving to the age of the sixth sun. And I don't think he even knew about any of that stuff. But for Steiner, the Earth, humanity is not just an accidental thing that just happened. Like the evolution of humanity and the Earth is very meshed together. And actually, in each incarnation of the Earth, humanity is kind of like reconstituted and develops like a different body. So in this time, the fourth incarnation of the Earth, we currently have the physical body, the etheric body or the life body, the astral body, and the I or the ego. In the previous incarnations, it started with just the physical body and the rudiments of that. Then we developed the etheric body, then the astral body. So this is the time when we've developed the I or the ego, the sense of self-identity. We're still struggling with that discovery, right? Because like when we sleep at night, all of these cravings and desires pour into us from the astral worlds, and they're almost too much for us to deal with. We end up falling into depression or anxiety or addiction and so on. But Steiner felt that as our I or ego strengthens over this period in this incarnation, we become more able to master the cravings that pour in from the astral body, and we begin to transform the astral body, and we form like this next body, which he talks about as the spirit self. And it's not like I'm not like imposing Steiner on you as like a ideology or whatever, but I think we do need like maps and ways of thinking about what's happening and where things are going or could be going that help us to build bridges in a way. So I think that his mapping is extremely powerful. And another reason why I would give him a lot of credit is he built these institutions that have lasted now over a century, which are still like good and healing institutions, like the Waldorf school system, which is really integrates his esoteric philosophy in very subtle ways. Like Steiner talked about these bodies developing in 7-year cycles. So first, when you're born, they're all kind of meshed together, and then slowly the etheric body separates. It fully separates when you're like 6 or 7. Then the astral body separates. Then you fully develop the I or the ego when you're around 21, and so on. So he didn't want children to learn to read until the etheric body and the physical body had separated around 6 or 7. So it was kind of a delayed idea that I grew up in a very literate household and was probably reading at like 3, and I can see when I think about it that maybe that was actually damaging. Like maybe it would be great to have less time, more time just to be, proprioceptive and sensorial and so on before we get inundated in abstract literary worlds and so on. So I think there's a lot of reasons to give Steiner credit, and one reason I wanted to bring him up, and the problem is his ideas are complex and would require so basically I learned about Steiner when I was going through my own psychedelic occult crisis, where I'd had a number of like very bizarre like bad trips with psychic phenomena and so on, and the occult worlds began to feel like, if people read like Crowley or like Carlos Castaneda, they're extremely dark. It's like being in like the New York subway at like 2 a.m. in like 1976 or something like that. And I was like, is that really what it's like? Like, this is terrifying, you know? But I had a friend who had been studying Steiner for years. I happened to run into him, and he gave me, like, you know, over like 3 or 4 hours, took me through this cosmology that Steiner presents in his work, which I also discuss in my work in Breaking Open the Head in 2012 in particular. But Steiner saw himself as an esoteric Christian, so he also saw that there was a meaning for, you know, the Christ being or the Christ incarnation. That was part of this process of humanity gaining this I, this independent self, and so on. This liberation, this capacity to choose our own direction. You know, I think Christ says something about leave your father and mother, and so on. You know, so that's kind of interesting. We don't hear Christ talked about, obviously, in these scenes very much. Like, we go for the indigenous or the shamanic or the, you know, or you know, the Buddhist or something. But what I feel what Steiner can help us do is kind of reintegrate aspects of, you know, esoteric Christianity, let's say, or Gnosticism or whatever, into this evolving worldview. But Steiner also, as an esoteric Christian, talked about, instead of there just being the devil as the evil force, there were actually different forces in the spirit world that work on humanity all of the time. And once again, I'm just saying this is a mapping that you can use, something that could help you if you want to think about these things. And so he separated the devil in a way to these different forces, and he named 2 of the main ones as Lucifer and Ahriman. So the Lucifer means light bringer. So Lucifer, in many ways, like Steiner's magazine was called Lucifer Gnosis, so he had a lot of good things to say about Lucifer. But Lucifer is a force that fills us with, you know, beauty, creativity, but also kind of like hubris and arrogance. Lucifer tends to pull us up and away from the earth. And Luciferic spirits kind of make pacts with human beings. For Steiner, they're too far evolved to take physical bodies, but they can only evolve through us by making a deal with us. So if you have like a genius, like the word genius sort of comes from the word genie, like the djinn, the genie in the bottle. It's like the genius is in somebody who's like temporarily, you know, has this pact with a spirit, with a djinn or a genie to perform a certain type of function, or, you know, create a certain type of art or something. So somebody like Mozart or Shakespeare or whatever was like, for Steiner, they would have been, or Rimbaud, you know, they would have had this pact with a Luciferic being that was, you know, exploring reality kind of through them. So Lucifer is good in a way, but pulls us up and away from the earth, into hubris, arrogance, contempt even. And the other force that works on us all the time, Steiner called Ahriman. So Ahriman comes from the Zoroastrian tradition. So Ahriman is a force that's the sort of earth spirit, evil earth spirit, that for Steiner is pulling us all the way down towards sterility, materiality, mechanization, and a kind of sterile death in a way. And so Steiner actually felt that we were in a time when Ahriman was in his ascendance, and Ahriman would ultimately incarnate into the human world. And this is not something that we could prevent, but the more we brought our consciousness into it as a spiritual process and awareness of this almost being a kind of being that has to have its time, the better we could mediate it, and the better we could help humanity kind of like in this process. So for me, when we're talking about the Ahrimaic and that incarnation or ascendancy, it seems very likely that has to do with artificial intelligence, which is, you know, developing this kind of incredible, you know, capacities. And also, you know, we'll probably never know if any form of artificial intelligence has a kind of self-reflection the way we have self-reflection or self-awareness. We won't even be able to tell, because it'll be able to fool us. But, you know, soon we'll see AI in robots, or, you know, maybe with biotechnology even in human form. So a lot of things that Steiner prophesied or predicted, when I see something like this, I'm like, wow, like he really was onto something. He understood something that seems to be happening. Okay, so that was some of the ideas I wanted to share. Let me see what else. Well, let's see what comes up with some questions, if that's cool. Anybody have like a question? Yeah, back there. Yeah, take 1 second.
Is the room like that? Maybe do this one shouting, get the room.
Oh yeah, you want to shout it out?
So you said your father's an artist?
Yeah.
So I've been really interested in the interaction between run of the artist and creating realms and the collective imagination.
Yeah.
And whether any other cultures have built on this idea.
I don't know about whether any other cultures, but for me, I mean, the imagination is our greatest capacity. Like I very much agree with like William Blake's idea that somehow the imagination is like the human existence in itself. And once again, if we think about the future of society, the future of consciousness, it would be very much about our capacity to make use of the imagination as a kind of cognitive organ, or organ of perception and creation. And I feel like we're just touching upon that. I mean, even festivals such as this, which are imaginative creations, or the Burning Man festivals, where you can set different rules for how people interact, and you can say there's no commerce, it's a gift economy. I see that as part of the future. I wonder also, like, one of my favorite political essays, actually it's my favorite political essay of all time, is by Oscar Wilde, to bring up another Brit. So Oscar Wilde only wrote one political essay. It was called The Soul of Man Under Socialism. And so basically Oscar Wilde saw that, when this was back in the early, late 19th century, early 20th century, that not everybody got a chance to really develop their unique individuality. Like most people were trapped in work and poverty and so on. And, but there were people who often had independent means, who got to be artists and really like then cultivate their unique perspective, their creativity and so on. And he felt that was like, should ultimately be the natural birthright of humanity as a whole. But the only way to get there would actually be through a form of socialism, a form of like a system where the machines actually developed to the point where they were able to do all of the drudgery, or most of the drudgery or the hard labor, and humans would be liberated to perform what for him was our natural function, which he called cultivated leisure. That was his perspective, but here we can also see we can add ceremony to that, or we can add ritual, we can add play, we can add creativity and so on. And I think that's why these festivals feel like home. It's almost like a memory from the future, right? Like we feel that, we're meant to live like this, and all the drudgery and the misery is just like somehow that's like the transitional stage to get to the bliss and the comfort in a way. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Do you think we are seeing now the end of Homo sapiens? The thinking one, the one who understands, the so-called wise one, and the consciousness that has been coming with Homo sapiens, and that we are now perhaps emerging into something new that is beyond the level of consciousness that we've experienced with Homo sapiens, the thinking one. I'd just like to hear your comments about that.
You mean in terms of like a technological development or something?
Well, I personally see that technology, AI, is really an extension of Homo sapiens, because smart machines can outthink us, humans. They think much better. So we might need to rediscover what it means to be human again.
Yeah. I guess my personal feeling is we're still at the beginning of discovering what it means to be human. And what we experience in like transformational states or transpersonal states give us an inkling. When we think of these these different capacities, whether it's the Tibetan monk who's able to reach the rainbow body, or the qigong master who can throw people across the room with their qi or heal them, just from that perspective. Like I feel like we need like a few thousand years just to be able to develop our inner capacities, because we don't know how incredible they might be and where they might lead us. So I'd like to personally put off this idea of like merging with technology for a good long time, if not forever, and just see what it actually would mean to be fully human. But I'm also not anti-technology in a sense. If we can master our projections, then maybe we can harmonize our life on the biosphere. Because there's no reason we can't scale up permaculture or use the internet to train people in regenerative practices, or kind of protecting, shepherding biodiversity. Like we just haven't fully applied our creativity to this yet, because we've been a little bit like this evolution has happened extremely fast, right? Like 150 years ago, we were in horses or just walking around with nothing, technologically. So this has happened so fast. And I think that there could be a totally different direction that would be more beautiful for us in the future, if we could sort of stop and think about it. I really agreed with a lot of Helena's talk yesterday on localization, kind of that is a direction, like multiplicity, localization, decentralization, but still using these kind of coordinating frameworks of things like the internet so that we can harmonize human society. Yeah.
What are for you the main obstacles what are the main obstacles that don't permit? Sorry, my English is not that good. So, what are the main obstacles that forbid, like the fusion between Jungian worldview and the materialistic worldview?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're still, I mean, this all happened so quickly, right? Like a few hundred years ago, we developed science and the scientific method and empiricism, and that seemed to provide all these answers, so, and then we all kind of glommed onto that, right? Like, so it's we're just in a process, and, I mean, we can just see how, things happen slow and fast in a straight way. When I wrote Breaking Up in the Head in 2002, in the book I talked about how, like, why aren't psychedelics, being explored more, used more, and now this like huge psychedelic movement has sprung up, and they are being used, but then even there, that leads to all these other levels of discovery and question. Is the therapeutic context like the best context? Are they really about healing? Is that really what indigenous cultures, were mainly focused on using them for? Were there other uses? I think it's like a process. Like, I try to look at everything on a sort of more meta level as a kind of evolutionary process, let's say. Like, and that can only happen by things like overcorrecting and then going back around and then swinging back and forth. So we sort of went way too far into the empiricism, into only valuing things that could be quantified or understood rationally. And now we're trying to find our way. Even in the last panel, people talking about how they want to quantify kind of these ineffable mystical experiences, and we're still we're still in this sort of dialectic right now. And it's a process, but I think I see progress. Being here makes me feel a lot of hope. Actually, like I see the level to which people are becoming more sophisticated and awakening and connecting and sharing. And then I think about the morphogenetic field effect and how when a certain level of the species maybe develop a new understanding or a new way that can really move very quickly across the whole field of the species mind. That could happen with our situation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I loved your book 2012, Return of Quetzalcoatl, and that was very informative for me. I'm wondering what your thoughts are now about the idea of the two-world split, which I understand to be a Mayan idea, and also expounded by channels such as Dolores Cannon, if I recall correctly. And as 2012 has come and gone, and there have been some transitions, but some things are very much business as usual, so we say. What if you do perceive that two-world split as something that's occurring, what you think about the timeline over which that might occur, as some of us might be getting a little bit impatient at this point.
I mean, I don't know. I have no idea. I think there are just some things that are meant to be mysterious, and we can basically, we do what we can to understand. I mean, one way of understanding the, from the prophetic perspective, there's a Aztec shaman, his name will come back to me in a second. He wrote a book called The Dawn of the Sixth Sun. So he said that from the Aztec perspective, we're exiting, between 2012 and 2021 was the transition from the time of the fifth sun and the time of the sixth sun. So these are like 5,100 year cycles or something. So the transitions are significant. Like, in our lives we'll only be partially through those transitions. But he said that from this Toltec perspective, the fifth sun was a sun of light, and we're moving into what he calls a sun of darkness. So that sounds a little bit scary, or intimidating, but the way he kind of goes deeper into explaining it is that in a period of the sun of light for the last 5,000 years, like the predominant, let's say, frequency or tonality of human consciousness on the planet is kind of waking, rational, empirical, discovering, everything that we can discover about the material world, sort of culminating in the scientific method. And as we go into a sun of darkness period, the tonality of consciousness shifts back to the psychic, the unconscious, the dream worlds. And I think like we can sort of feel that, like, even if we think about like Trump or these things, these impossible things that keep happening all around the world, it feels like like reality is becoming a little bit more like a waking dream, and manifestations happen faster and faster. Like the pace of things keep picking up. It's subtle, but I think if you're attuned to it, you sense that this is happening in some ways. Yeah.
Great. But some of my friends here can attest that I got goosebumps earlier. I've been strangely obsessed with Zoroastrianism. I work in psychedelic science and AI ethics. So naturally, for some reason, I was pulled into this dialectic between these twin spirits, the rising sun, and then Ahriman, the spirit. So when you brought this up, that AI is of that energy, it's like it clicked. So I'm wondering, do these models, are they still relevant, or should we move past this dualist, I don't know if it's dualist, but this dialectic, and what might Steiner have to say on that as well?
Which dualism do you mean?
Between Ahura Mazda, in a way, representing Prometheus, technology, rationality, linearity, and then the grounded, pulling down spirit that you referred to, the Ahriman. Yeah.
I don't know if I know how to answer that, but I can say that I feel compelled to speak about something else. I wanted to talk a little bit about an idea that I really like to share, I guess. I'm very interested in the Gaia theory, like Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock, and so maybe we're in if we look at what's happened over the last hundreds of years with humans on the planet. It sort of reminds one of an evolutionary birthing process, right? Like we were sort of widely separated, then we built trade routes, then we built highways, then we built, internet, fiber optics. We have been kind of connecting as one global mind. I mean, people know about the idea of the noosphere. So basically this idea from Teilhard de Chardin that there's this collective kind of thought sphere on the planet, and that ultimately we're gonna activate it and we'll be sort of one unified being on a higher framework. So that all really I find very fascinating and compelling. And then it allows us maybe to think about things that seem very negative or destructive in the short term. Maybe if we were able to have a more meta perspective, we'd still, we want to fight against them. I mean, I actually meant to talk a little bit about cognitive capitalism. If we think about how capitalism kind of operates, right? Because it's a system based on debt, right? So it constantly needs to create new markets. So the way it does that is by taking things that people used to do for themselves and kind of taking it away from them and then selling it back to them. So we used to just get water from local springs. Now we have to buy, Evian or whatever. We used to just educate our own kids. Now they have to go to these schools. We used to tell stories around the fire. Now we're watching Netflix or, watching Instagram stories. So capitalism has this inherent tendency to alienate, things that were just natural to us, then sell it back to us. So I don't think it's, this is why Helena and I were having a debate this morning, and she talks about, the evil men who are in charge of the whole thing. I think you could look at it that way, but it's also just a very complex adaptive system based on an economic logic that, is inherently destructive for us and for the planet, that at one point we're going to have to address at its root, because it's not going to be sustainable for much longer. But yeah, so the cognitive capitalism is now that we've kind of made the world into one market, and we've kind of, done all this kind of expropriating the stuff that people used to do for themselves externally. Now capitalism is kind of going into the brain, right? So like a GPS, a child between the age of 10 and 16 is developing the hippocampus, which is about spatial navigation, spatial learning, and so on. And actually, kids are supposed to kind of get lost, right? Get lost in the forest with their friends, and oh, was it that stone, that rock? How do I get back? But now kids are growing up, 10, they're given a smartphone or whatever, and so they're never really developing those capacities. So, in a way, it's not clear if they ever will develop them once that's if they don't if they don't do it between the age of 10 and 16. And the hippocampus is not just spatial memory. Like a lot of our memories are very spatial. Like in the Renaissance, they had this thing called memory palaces, where if you wanted to learn something complicated, you would put it in all these different rooms and kind of like drawers in a palace, like a language or something. So so I think that we have this thing where cognitive capitalism is trying to now go into the brain and actually reshaping the brain, because if your hippocampus doesn't develop that much gray matter, you've shifted the way the brain operates. Another example is AI. Now instead of like, I don't have to write a paper about William Blake and Shakespeare, I'll just ask ChatGPT to write it for me. So now we're outsourcing like our basic reasoning functions to that. So I think that's like super dangerous. Okay, 1 second. Oh, you want to go? You want to go ahead, Bruce?
No, only when you're done, buddy.
Okay, cool. So that's super dangerous. Now, so that's one. So there's different things happening all at once. On another level, I think we could look at, on a meta-structural level, like, let's say humanity and the Earth do constitute one giant organism, that's becoming more self-reflective. Like, in a weird way, what are the organs of that organism, or the nascent organs of that organism? In a weird way, I think you could say that they're multinational corporations. So like an energy company is kind of like the blood and the circulation system, moving energy through the body. A financial company is kind of like the nerves, where I think it was you who actually suggested that to me, where it's like instantaneous response. It gets like the nerve energy goes where it needs to go. A sanitation company is like the liver. A media company is like the sensory organs, right? That's taking in the raw data of what's being experienced and converting into memes, into narrative, and into ways for that collective body to understand what's happening. But unfortunately, all of this is happening in an immature economic system that's based on exploitation and debt and extraction, right? But you could see if there was, let's say, global awakening, 100th monkey, shift, those types of collective organizations could become symbiotic rather than parasitic, and then we would have a potential maybe for a very fast evolution in a more positive direction. That was the idea that I wanted to get out there. Bruce.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Always enjoy your thinking. Going back to panpsychism is where you started. A number of years ago came across the idea that consciousness perhaps had phases. So like water can be ice, it can be vapor, it can be flowing water, but it's always still water. Maybe consciousness could also be separate while at the same time being unified and all made of the same thing, even though having different forms. And to my mind, that kind of answered some of the complexities around maybe Eastern philosophy of oneness versus scientific separation. And it sort of clicked for me a little bit, and I was wondering if you could riff on that and give us your thoughts.
I don't know. I liked your thoughts. No, I think I agree with you. I mean, I don't know what else to add. I mean, there's a unified field of consciousness. I'm totally. I went to a Dzogchen retreat. So Dzogchen is like a form of Tibetan Buddhism that ultimately, if you get really good at Dzogchen, you never even have to meditate. You're just always in this state of awareness. But the awareness is that there's like ultimately no differentiation. Everything is just this primordial awareness experiencing itself. So any differentiation is just a temporary expression, the dynamic energy of awareness expressing itself, and then you withdraw your projection from that. So yeah, but I think you're right. It's just it densifies, it crystallizes, it steams, it rises, and it takes different forms. And we're in the flow of that process, individually and collectively.
I wanted to respond to the gentleman who asked
about
Zoroastrianism.
Yeah.
Oh yes. The symbol of Ahura Mazda is a bit like that bird. It has 3 layers of wings, representing good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. And Ahriman is the reverse of those things, the realm of aggression and deception. And I would just refer you to Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, because there he argues that what was good in Zoroastrian times and what was bad became inverted through Christianity. And in Christianity, the meek, the weak, good. And the former, more like foraging, pillaging, hunting, strong, became bad. So that was Nietzsche's beef with Christianity. And also Robert Sepehr, Sepehr, talks about how the Magi...
Okay, let's open it to one more question. Thank you. Yeah, over here. Oh yeah, or her. Go ahead.
Okay, hi. About 2 years ago, I first heard light language.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've heard it.
I know about it a little bit.
Yeah. And then, so I looked into it, and a lot of people speak this language, and they talk about it being a celestial download. And then I've also been researching crop circles.
Yeah.
I wonder if you've done any research on something called the Chilbolton incident that happened in 2001.
Yeah.
And it being a reply from another galaxy. Because when you say it's hard to talk about the supernatural, and I'm a writer too, I'm trying to write about 2050, there are so many interesting people in the world of researching visitors, other galaxies. People say that Cybercillin came on a meteor. And then there's this idea of hiding in plain sight. I also come from the global south. So a lot of things that happen where I come from look like magic, and they're not. So I just wondered if we could maybe even touch on why. And also, I was talking to a really famous journalist recently, and I brought up visitors, and she just shut down immediately. And she said, "Where's the proof?" And I said, "It's everywhere. People are talking, thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, blah, blah, blah. It's everywhere." And I just wondered what you might have to say about this.
Chilbolton, she's talking about in 2001, which is obviously was the year of the movie, 2001. This crop circle appeared. That was a reply to a message that we'd sent out to space in, I think, the 70s. That showed like a little human and our DNA and I can't remember a few other things. So this pattern came back in the field that showed like a different kind of being, like with a bigger head, smaller, with like an extra strand of DNA, right next to a satellite dish, a huge satellite dish. Yeah, I mean, there's I mean, I've had so many friends who've had profound experiences of being like pulled into other dimensions. People were very rational and believable and so on. It's interesting how it hovers outside of our capacity to like bring it down, right? That seems to be intentional. Like the crop circles themselves, like, yeah, I talked to somebody at like Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and he was like, look, if these extraterrestrials wanted to, talk to us, they would just, leave an Encyclopedia Galactica on our doorstep, or they would talk to the government or whatever. But then, I was like, well, actually, like in so many ways, the crop circles are a fascinating concept, And once again, it's like, maybe it's a hoax. Let's just play the thought experiment out, because I do think, whether you look at what happens to the plants and the formations, the incredible precision of many of them, many other aspects of them. There was an astronomer from Boston University who found like new Euclidean paradigms, and even the early crop circles were just simple circles. He put them out in like a math magazine. Like no human had ever discovered these Euclidean paradigms. It was like they were kind of like telling us that they had a different level of knowledge in a very subtle way. But it's subtle and playful, and it's like a public address system, because anybody can go on the internet and read about it. All the they're not copyrighted. You can make a T-shirt with any of the designs or whatever. It's like open source, right? So and it bypasses government. It bypasses establishments. It's actually, if I was maybe a certain type of intelligence, galactic intelligence, who wanted to kind of alert a certain bandwidth or frequency of human beings that there was more going on in the universe, it might be actually a really genius signal system. So yeah, it's actually something that I'm still very much wanting to do a research project in, because when I wrote my book, the 2012 book, I had about 100 pages about the crop circles, and even the experiences you have when I was exploring them, they were like very psychedelic, like incredible synchronicities, and when you go into the new ones, like you have like people go into like visionary states, and so many things happened in them. And I was sure that after the book came out, which was like 2006, 7, somebody was going to come to me and be like, okay, let's do a real research project. Let's dig in and figure this out. And actually, I think now with artificial intelligence, that also could be utilized. Like, in 1997, there was like 150 patterns in England alone or something. So like that would be like 10 teams doing like 15 patterns each for no reason. Like, yeah, I mean, yeah. Yeah, I don't know about hundreds of years, but it's possible. But certainly recently,
One more question.
Yeah, one more question. Yeah, yeah. Hi, Brett.
Hey.
Yeah.
I got a question about, maybe it's like a meta question on the politics of esotericism.
Okay, cool.
All right. So, and I guess what you've been doing in this talk, which I find fascinating, is that I can see your mind weaving through all these things, and you spent a long time putting all those connections together, right?
Yeah.
But you're not the only person doing that.
Yeah.
There's going to be many other people who are playing into the same thing about a rejection of, let's say, sterile materialism, Western rationalism, etc. For example, there's lots of people on the far right who are doing exactly the same thing right now. And so I guess what the question is, almost like, how does one navigate this space? Let's say a person has a hunger for the esoteric, but not necessarily like, 8 months of their time to actually go through all the connections, because realistically, to go through all the connections you've mentioned in your talk, it's going to take us a lot of work, right? And there's going to be many other people competing for that same mind space. And I just wonder what are the tools people can actually use when they're trying to navigate, like, let's say, a rejection of the sort of standard narrative, but without lapsing into some bullshit kind of like stuff, right? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I think like, what I would love actually to see at these, I know these kind of events are very heart-based and somatic, and I think that's incredibly important and very important for me right now also. But I remember when I went to Dharamsala, which is the Tibetan Buddhist headquarters, they had all these monks in the public square doing these Dharma debates in this very impassioned way, where they would like make a point about like Buddhist Dharma, and they would go, ha! And they would like slap their hand, and the other monk would make a point and like slap their hand. I feel like we need something like that. We need like to wrestle with ideas and not, because we need to get this right. So like, for instance, personally, I was very put off by Zach Bush's talk yesterday, and a number of things he said felt like landed very poorly for me. When he talked about 12-strand DNA, or when he talked about bacteria emitting more light than a million suns or whatever. I feel like you go in and sort of dazzlement, and I hope I didn't do that to people here. I might have, but yeah. So you have to get to a certain level of discernment. You have to do a little bit of intellectual work, and I think you have to really make a distinction between what you kind of know through direct experience, what you want to be the case, what you think might be the case. And you have to keep coming back to being like, if I'm going off in this direction, I had an experience. Personally, I've had experiences of, voices. In my book 2012, I had a experience where a voice that announced itself as Quetzalcoatl spoke in my head for a week and dictated a prophecy. But ultimately, I'm like, okay, I don't know that that's what it said was true, or that was really that voice. But how fascinating, because that's what all the, you read like, Moses or Muhammad, like they all had these types of experiences. So that experience is something that you can have as a human being was incredibly interesting. So yeah, I think it keeps coming back to like, what do I know from direct experience? And how, and then that also requires people, because I think people need to explore deeper, because you can really have, psychic experiences, telekinesis. Like I think all these things are available as we go deeper into these worlds and practices. So there's or what do I know from trusted experience, or like friends who I really trust, that they're really always trying to be in authenticity, and they were pulled into another dimension one night by a light being when they were wide awake, and the way they told it like resonated with me, and I was like, yeah, like I actually believe that happened to them, and then and then what do I think that could mean? What are the range of possibilities of what that could mean? And just realize that our minds quickly go into like schema and mapping, and obviously the map is never the territory. So how do we keep coming back to what we know, what's best available to us through good evidence, and then where we're going into speculation, or fantasy. I guess that's my answer. But it would be interesting to talk about the far right occult stuff more with you. Okay, I think that's my time. Is that it?
Yes, I think
Okay.
so. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it.